Next up, we will talk about the good old days. And not the good old days as in the old good old days, but we're going to talk about the good old days as in now. As I search for a quote, Jerry, I think it was that philosopher, was it Andy Bernard from The Office in the last episode, who said, I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them.
I could never watch The Office because it made me dizzy.
The camera motion or Michael
yes.
Scott?
The camera. I've heard, I feel like I know Michael Scott because my kids liked watching it and others like yourself talk about it. I have no idea who he is. And because 5 seconds watching that and I wanted to go get sick. It was this weird sort of avant-garde kind of approach to it. It's the Blair Witch Project method of making a movie or making a TV series is that constantly moving camera just made me sick.
Jerry, in the business, that's what's called as a single camera sitcom.
Okay.
So you have the old days, like you're watching Different Strokes or Facts of Life, and you've got the multiple camera, the static camera setup.
I like that.
You only get a few
make
shots.
Me sick.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Thomas family, if you will, something pulling all.
I'm getting off of topic, so go ahead.
Well, the point, this wasn't even a Michael Scott quote. This was an Andy Bernard quote. But anyway, I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them. When it comes to the economy, Jerry, it's fun to trash on the economy in a lot of ways because everyone likes being the smartest person in the room, and the way you act like you're the smartest person in the room, if you're not the smartest person in the room, is to just say bad things about other things.
Yeah.
And I am certainly guilty of that once or twice in my life. And we've got some headwinds. Excuse me. Some headwinds just blew my face. We've got some headwinds from an economic standpoint and from a societal standpoint. Don't get me wrong. You and I both know that very well. But we do have to look at the reality is that we've got the S&P at an all-time high. Small cap stocks are not in the same boat, but doing significantly better than they were. And as I like to say, one of my most overused idioms, distance and mileage may vary, because because people, especially at the lower end of the totem pole, or I shouldn't say totem pole, but the socioeconomic scale, definitely are struggling due to inflation.
Yeah.
But could we still kind of be in the good old days?
It's interesting that you bring that up, and I would I'm going to give a dirty secret here that we do hardly any kind of show prep. It probably shows, but I think you told me you were going to say something about that. Oh, I don't know, grand total maybe 2 seconds before we turned everything on, which is fun. We like to sort of ad-lib. Comes from Doug's past and works. But it's funny you say that because I was just reading, and this a hat tip to Scott Granis and his Calafia Beach Pundit blog. Source the Federal Reserve, the net worth of U.S. private sector, $156 trillion. Wow. Kind of puts in perspective, because to your point, what we always hear is, oh my gosh, we're going so far into debt, we can't pay our bills and da-da-da-da-da. And don't get me wrong, the growth in the debt is concerning. But when you put $33 trillion worth of debt up against $156 trillion worth of assets, the bulk of which, by the way, are financial assets, not real estate assets, the debt starts to look pretty small. Now, some might say, well, that's, fluffed up because of the debt. Well, I mean, even that debt's probably not enough to completely puff it up. So some of these statistics, it shows, and this is, again, hat tip Scott Granis. I'm reading, quoting his blog post where he says, financial assets have increased by 120%, while real estate assets have increased 90%. And debt increased 41%, which is very interesting because actually debt has grown less than the value of the real estate stock and the value of financial asset stock. So it's to suggest that the net worth of Americans is actually in pretty darn good shape. You don't hear that very often. And even when you adjust for inflation, because that's the next thing. Now, inflation is not a good thing. We don't like inflation. But even when adjusting for inflation, the upward trend is significant. So yeah, I think like you say, it's popular to be the naysayer because it makes you seem smart. But if you're really looking at, what's really going on out there, it's actually not as horrible. And in some ways, you might even say it's pretty darn good compared to what most people think. Again, it all does need to be put into the perspective of each person has their own particular experience. But one more nugget that came out of there is out of that analysis of overall net worth, and granted this is skewed because you have billionaires out there that are skewed the numbers, but the average resident in the United States has a net worth of about $460,000. That's remarkable. And even accounting for the billionaires and many of those that have little or nothing, but it's still pretty remarkable. And this is adding up the value of homes, buildings, businesses, infrastructures, whatever. It's really pretty amazing. So yeah, I think the way I would respond to that is it's never as good as you think it is, and it's never as bad as you think it is, and it's probably never as bad as the 24/7, 365 financial media wants you to believe it is, just because that keeps you glued to that that news story every day. Does that answer that? Does that give you a fair enough idea of my view on that?
And I think that makes sense. I would say, adding on to that, the net worth is good for the Americans who have a net worth, because I think that's where we get into distance and mileage may vary, is that I think that the people who have assets, much like we saw an accelerated version of this during COVID, the people who have assets do well. And these times of crisis are a chance to double down, whether you think that we have technocrats who are manipulating the society, or you just talking about people who have the chance to take the wherewithal to take a little bit of a larger view and to view these cataclysmic events as transitory and a buying opportunity.
Yeah.
These type of events will work well for the people who pounce on the opportunity. And we had two years of an opportunity, really, in a lot of ways, to buy in and increase your assets. I think we see time and time again that running into cash out of fear is a fool's errand.
Well, and I think we've talked about before, and again, certainly there are people that are in situations, sad as it is and horrible as it is, where they literally have nothing. Fortunately, there's not as many of those in this country as there are in others, thank God. But they exist. But that said, we talked about things like, instead of going out and getting a steak dinner at a steakhouse, you make your own. Instead of going out and buying espressos every day, you make your own. I mean, there are things that regular people can do that gets them, especially when they're younger, gets them started in building that wealth. And it does make a difference when you're younger, putting what seem to be like small amounts of money away. I'm telling you, it's been proven over and over again. It works. It does work. So there's a discipline that needs to come in here. And too many people, I think, get away with, oh, well, we can't afford to do this and we can't afford to do that. And I get, and they say it's easy for me to sit here in our position and say, get some discipline. But the fact is that's what needs to happen. And, there's really no reason in this country that people, if they're disciplined, can't figure out a way to start building wealth, and the younger, the better. And I would also say, because we hear so much about debt, and I'm okay with debt when it's used properly. I don't like it when it's used frivolously or in a bad way. But the very interesting thing is since the 08-09 crisis, the average American has paid down debt and has reduced their debt burden. It's the government that's been going crazy with debt. And that is that's a very good thing that regular private citizens have been doing what they're doing. It's a very bad thing that the government continues to be insatiable in their spending. But there's a balance there. And so, it's not all bad, I guess is what I'm saying. So that's the ultimate answer to your question. No, it's not all bad. In fact, it's actually pretty good in most cases. Not as good as it could be. It could be a lot better, and we could be doing things smarter, but let's not, digress to the point where we think all is lost, because it's definitely